So we're going to move into the third phase of this presentation on some of the failure mechanisms. I've put some pictures here. We have some in the handouts that you have. We're going to talk about cracked brick and concrete piers, deflection and framing members, and maybe we can expand upon it. So this is brand new construction. I'm telling you, old and or new. This is brand new construction. Pretty intense, engineered foundation plan. Heavily sloped lot. A lot of chain wall over here on the left side. A lot of chain wall, and we have piers that are locked into the spread footing foundation. So a rather robust foundation plan and a very high building. So it's subject to a lot of wind load. The building is under construction. And as we went through, the owner called me, who was an engineer and kind of focused on his project, and he said, look, I've got some issues going on, I need you to come out, take a look at it. This is an example of what we found. Look at this pier. It's the top of the pier right up in here. Not on this particular one, but this is the top of the pier. And I believe there were 8 piers that were cracking like this, some worse than this. And this chain wall, this one back here, had a crack all the way down. It's still under construction. There's no finishes in the house, what have you. And walked this property probably about 2 hours, and I couldn't figure things out. This is how obvious some things are. So on a complex project like this, I'd suggest you walk around, or your superintendent walk around and kind of pay attention to detail. Long story short, on this particular property, very few of the bolts were locked into the frame. These bolts here, you've got angles here, steel angles, locking the assembly into the piers right here and to the framing members. The bolts are loose to the point of I could just take my hand and loosen them like this. They weren't torqued down at all. So what does that mean? Above this point right here, I would think the building went up, could have been 30 feet. 2-story, vaulted ceiling, beautiful place. It's under construction, and when the wind starts blowing on it, this starts moving. And there's an anchor bolt coming through here, completely breaking out of the pier. So we basically have a building sitting on a bunch of piers that's moving around when the wind blows. Now, it's common sense, right? Tighten the bolt. But these are the kinds of details. Doesn't happen often, but these are the kind of details that people overlook. The things that you assume are taken care of. The other, while I have this up, is under certain circumstances, one needs to be cognizant of scour with rainwater that may be coming underneath the building. When you start eroding some of that spread footing, that can create a big problem for you. So just taking advantage of talking about this one here. But anyway, to the point, this loose framing connections, all of it. Look what's going on right here. You see? Can you see this? The LVLs are separating. That's a triple 1, 2, 3. It's a multiply LVL assembly over the rear. It's got a lot of load to it, and now they're separating because these connections are loose. This one is a bit egregious, to say the least, but it was in a hurricane zone down in Dulac. Ultimately, I just recommended the guy just tear the whole building down. This entire assembly, first of all, it's in Dulac, so it's always wet in Dulac, right? That's why you put your white boots on before you go down there. But nonetheless, this happens here locally too, where the water gets up underneath the house. You start getting some differential settlement. This was grossly impacted by Ida and it racked this entire building. I did not put the picture in where the whole building was literally leaning to one side. But this is an example, a couple of things. We talked about filling cells with concrete, right? This is an example of how bad things can get. Doesn't always have to get this bad. You can get these fracture cracks on the corners, like right through here, when the building starts moving. So foundation, fortification, compaction, all of that matters, and will help you manage these circumstances. And let's be fair. These were not grouted in, loose fill, those kind of things. All right. This we see more often than I'd like to. This assembly here is a raised foundation. It was at grade, floodplain issue, get it raised up. But more to the point, when beams are splitting at midpoint, we've got a load path breach. We've got a serious problem going on. You see this? This beam here is represented right here. The piers on this particular house were fine. It was the frame assembly integration into the piers that got away. This was an engineered plan, raised house, part of the federal government program. I'm not sure what it is, but if you flood too often, they raise your house. That's what this is. The engineered plan called for this assembly here to be a double 2x12, bolted together, and then you side load. You side load the joist into the multiply beam. You with me? Very common framing technique. It did not and had nothing to do with installing a 6x6 underneath that assembly. So I guess there was a thought of when in doubt, make it stout line of thinking. That didn't work because what they didn't do is install a double 2x12. They installed the floor joist assembly over this 6x6. So it made it deflect and bend, and this is what happens. Now that beam is only this thick instead of the whole depth.
Is that 6x6 pictured on the left?
This is not, it doesn't correlate directly to that, but it is the same building, but it doesn't correlate directly to it. Let me talk about this one first, then we'll go back to the other one. So you can look at this. This is the same building. You can look at this assembly. That beam is grossly overloaded. And what you'll notice is, instead of putting a double 2x12, as was called for in the engineering design, these joists should have integrated with joist hangers into the double 2x12. Contractor omitted that detail, put this beam in place, and put these joists bearing on this beam as opposed to integrating into the beam. You follow the difference? And then you can see the deflection that's occurring. And then in the middle of the beam, look what's happening. It starts splitting. That's because when beams begin to bend, the bottom part goes in tension, the top part goes in compression, and at some point in the stress of that beam, there's a layer that wants to tear apart. Can you envision that? And this is an example of what will happen when that occurs. Not only that, you will notice here in this joist, even the joint, it deflects so much the joists are ripping. You follow this? Do you see this here? I had some other details. Many of the joists, in fact, 14 joists, new joists, were split in half because of deflection in the framing, because of the change in this design right here. Also, back to the other attention to detail, here are the straps. This one is not terrible, but they had other straps here where you're tying the floor frame assembly into the pier. Many of the straps are loose, twisted, had gaps in them. It's not doing you any good. If you have a gap in the strap that equates to 2 inches, that means in a high wind event, like a hurricane, that building can actually lift 2 inches before you have function of that strap. What's the point at that point in time? I'll learn how to use this. So differential settlement is very, very common, especially on these isolated piers. Foundation contractors and what have you want to go back in and beef up the system. Many of these pier systems are brick from years going by, 50, 60 years. But this pier, these are the things I want you to understand. The load from above in the wall system is coming through this beam, right through here and down here. Look how this pier is rotating because it's eccentrically loaded. It's just tipping. Very, very common. Also notice how there's some movement here because the beam connection to the pier is actually gapped. And you're bearing more right here than you are over here. If you look, there's a little crack coming through here. So now this pier is getting more of that compression. Okay, so the takeaway, what I'd suggest on these arrangements here is review the foundation plans in detail, check the clearances, back to what I said earlier about gutter allowances, brick veneer allowances, whatever those circumstances may be. Just review that so that you can manage it when you're putting your formwork in place. Sometimes we'll see where there may be a bust in getting your spread footing laid out just right with your piers or whatever the circumstance may be. And what happens is you wind up eccentrically loading, just like that other example was, you load that foundation, that spread footing the wrong way. All right, so that's the whole point there. We talked about compaction. I default to 95 standard Proctor. Standard Proctor is the test that we discussed earlier, where you get the bell curve. All right, there's modified Proctor. There's a bunch of different elements that can come out. That's usually in heavy construction. In residential, I think if you get to 95, you're doing well. What do you guys see on plans, or do you even see it? What do people call out? 90, 88? I've seen some diminished numbers, but what do you see? 95? Good. That's kind of a default, 95 standard Proctor. Again, just some kind of typical things. Install reinforcement with precision, especially when you're coming through the top of your pier, to make sure your beam and your angles and your bolts all set like they need to set. Fully and completely fill all of the CMU cells so we don't fracture the CMU blocks when they get loaded. Tighten the bolts. Some of these are kind of straightforward. So, all right, that is our presentation. Any questions?
Spread footings, that should be centered with the CMU blocks.
As much as possible, yes. I would bring the CMU load straight into the center of the spread footing. Unless there's another requirement that prohibits that, I would try to bring it straight through. Think of a snowshoe. You'd rather load a snowshoe right in the middle as opposed to the edge. So think of it that way. That's what I'd suggest you do. So.
I also noticed you had dropped them down below grade.
Yes.
Do you recommend that, or? Flush with grade?
You can.
Benefit?
The benefit is that your bearing capacity. You can manage the stormwater. If you get it down, you can shape your dirt to manage stormwater from getting underneath the house. So that's a benefit of it. Once you establish the top height of your spread footing, you're kind of stuck at that point. usually, I would say, Gordon, your thoughts are welcome. But most of the time, we see water going underneath the house as opposed to shedding away from the house. So I think if you have soil there, you can help use it to guide the water away from your house. So that's my line of thinking. And generally speaking, the deeper you go with the spread footing, the more bearing capacity, soil pressure you can utilize, generally speaking. So last thing is, I'd ask you to take out your phone and hit the QR code and look at our website, House Tips, and lock it in and use it as a resource or share it with your clients and customers. See if that would be a resource. So anyway, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.